History often remembers conquerors as marble statues, silent and perfect. But before statues, before legends, there is always a young person staring at a map, wondering how far ambition can reach. In the summer of 336 BCE, a 20-year-old prince named Alexander inherited a kingdom on the edge of Greece. His father had been murdered. Rivals whispered that the boy was untested. Allies wavered. Across the sea stood the largest empire the world had ever seen. Persia, rich, ancient, seemingly unassailable. Imagine being that boy. You have just buried the men who built your army. You know half your nobles doubt you. You know cities once cowed by your father are watching, ready to revolt if you falter. You could stay safe, secure your borders, live a long life. Or you could gamble everything and try to rewrite the world. Alexander gambled. The world he was born into was not gentle. Greece was fractured. City-states schemed and betrayed each other. Persia loomed to the east, an empire of palaces and satraps stretching from the Aegean to India. No one in Europe had seriously imagined destroying it. Yet this young Macedonian looked at that empire and saw a challenge worthy of his name. He was not an ordinary youth. His mother, Olympias, had filled his ears with stories of divine descent, telling him he was kin to Achilles and Zeus. His father, Philip II, had forged a revolutionary army, long-piked phalanxes, elite cavalry, siegecraft no Greek polis could match. And Alexander had been educated by Aristotle himself, absorbing philosophy, science, and a vision that the world was bigger than the borders of Macedon. But destiny was not guaranteed. In the ancient world, kings died young and ambitious sons vanished into obscurity. Alexander had to prove himself immediately. Rebellions in Greece rose the moment Philip's body was cold. Thebes, proud and dangerous, prepared to break free. Athens watched carefully, ready to follow whoever looked strongest. The young king moved faster than anyone expected. He marched south, demanded obedience, and when Thebes defied him, he crushed it utterly. Slaughter, enslavement, the city leveled. It was a brutal statement. Challenge me and cease to exist. Athens bowed. Greece fell silent. In less than a year, Alexander had turned from a vulnerable heir into an unstoppable commander. But even that was not enough. His father had dreamed of invading Persia. Alexander would do more than dream. He would carry Greece across the sea and attempt to topple a superpower. He would march his companions and phalanxes into lands no Greek army had seen, not just to punish an ancient enemy, but to seize its throne. Think about the risk. Macedonia's resources were tiny compared to Persia's. The King of Kings could raise armies 10 times larger. The Persian fleet ruled the eastern Mediterranean. If Alexander failed, his kingdom would vanish and his name would be forgotten. Yet in 334 BCE, he led his troops to the edge of Asia and crossed anyway. Why? Glory, yes. Revenge for Persia's invasions a century earlier. A vision of uniting East and West. And perhaps a restless need to be more than his father, more than mortal. He had been told since childhood that he was destined for greatness. Now he would test whether the prophecy was real. This is the story of that gamble. A march that began on the Aegean coast and ended on the far side of India. An arc of conquest unmatched before or since. It is a story of genius in battle, of relentless drive, of men who followed one leader to the edge of the known world, and of what happens when a dream is too big for the body that carries it. Over the next hours, we will follow Alexander step by step. The lightning rise that secured Greece, the breathtaking victories that shattered Persia, the brutal campaigns in Central Asia, the push into India, and the tragic end in Babylon. We will see an army march farther than any European force had gone, endure deserts and mountains, meet elephants and chariots, and carry their king's vision until exhaustion broke them. Before we begin, hold one question in your mind. If you were 20, handed a weapon and a chance to chase immortality, would you take it? Would you risk everything, your life, your friends, your people, for a name that echoes through history? Alexander answered yes, and the world has been telling his story ever since. To understand Alexander, you must first understand the world his father built. When Philip II took the throne of Macedon in 359 BCE, the kingdom was a rough, half-forgotten state. Greek city-states looked down on it as barbaric. Its armies were scattered tribal levies, its politics unstable, its borders threatened by Illyrians and Thracians. Within 2 decades, Philip reshaped it into the most efficient military machine the Greek world had ever seen. He armed his infantry with the sarissa, a pike twice as long as a traditional hoplite spear, creating phalanxes that could smash through enemy lines. He drilled soldiers year-round until their movements became mechanical precision. He built a professional cavalry, the companion horsemen, trained to strike like a hammer once the phalanx fixed the enemy in place. He invested in siege technology, towers, rams, catapults, so walls no longer guaranteed safety. By the 340s BCE, this once-weak kingdom could face Athens, Thebes, and Sparta combined. Philip also wove politics as cleverly as he waged war. He married strategically, took hostages, spread Macedonian gold to keep enemies divided, and slowly brought the Greek world under his shadow. Yet his domestic life was volatile. Court plots, jealous nobles, and rival queens created a climate where assassination was always possible. In this world, young Alexander learned that power was fragile and speed decisive. Alexander's education was unlike any other prince's. Aristotle tutored him in philosophy, medicine, ethics, natural science, and the art of ruling. From Homer's Iliad, he drew an obsession with Achilles, the warrior who sought glory even at the cost of life. He memorized passages, slept with a copy under his pillow, and dreamed of emulating that heroism. But he also absorbed practical lessons: geography, administration, how to weld cultures together. By 16, he was already regent when Philip campaigned abroad. A Thracian tribe revolted. Alexander crushed it, founded a city named Alexandropolis to secure the frontier, and returned triumphant. At 18, he commanded the companion cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE. There, facing a coalition of Athens and Thebes, he led the decisive charge that broke the sacred band, the elite Theban unit feared across Greece. The result ended Greek independence and bound the cities to Philip's new league. For Macedon, the next step was obvious: Persia. Decades earlier, Xerxes had invaded Greece. Greek cities still remembered the burning of Athens. Now, with Greece subdued, Philip prepared to turn east and claim vengeance and riches. He sent troops ahead to Asia Minor to begin the campaign. Then, in 336 BCE, at a royal wedding in Aegae, Philip was assassinated. The killer, Pausanias, was cut down at once, but the plot behind him remains a mystery. Some blamed Persian agents, some whispered of Olympias, Philip's fierce and ambitious wife. Whatever the truth, the act left a dangerous vacuum. Alexander, only 20, was proclaimed king. But proclamations mean little if soldiers and allies doubt you. Doubt flared immediately. Thracians and Illyrians tested the borders. In Greece, Thebes and Athens assumed the young man would be weak. Rebellions sparked. This was Alexander's moment of trial. Hesitate, and he would be crushed. Move, and he might survive. He chose to move. Fast. He rode north first, smashing Illyrian and Thracian threats before they could unite. Then, in a stunning winter march, he appeared suddenly in central Greece. Thebes, always proud, resisted. Alexander demanded surrender. They refused, trusting that Athens and other cities would join them. No help came. In 335 BCE, Alexander assaulted Thebes with overwhelming force. Siege engines battered walls. Macedonian infantry poured through breaches. The city was annihilated. 30,000 inhabitants were killed or sold into slavery. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared, a calculated gesture to Greek culture. The brutality shocked Greece into silence. Athens, seeing the ruin of Thebes, submitted rather than share its fate. In less than a year, the young king had secured his throne, tamed rebellious tribes, and reminded Greece why Macedon ruled. The lesson was clear. The son was every bit as dangerous as the father. Now he turned to the sea. Philip's Asian expeditionary force had been left leaderless. Persian satraps were regaining ground. Alexander took command, proclaimed himself leader of the Corinthian League, and revived the grand plan. Invade Persia, avenge past invasions, and bring new wealth home. But Alexander was thinking beyond vengeance. He envisioned an empire spanning continents, fusing cultures. His mother tales of divine ancestry and his own relentless drive meant he would not settle for being merely Philip's successor. He wanted to surpass him. Spring 334 BCE. Ships gathered at the Hellespont. Soldiers who had grown up under Philip now followed his son. They crossed from Europe to Asia, a small army compared to Persia's resources, but led by a commander burning to prove that destiny favored the bold. The greatest gamble of his life was about to begin. In the spring of 334 BCE, the gamble became real. 40,000 men, Macedonian phalangites with their long sarissas, hardened cavalry companions, allied Greeks, and hired mercenaries, boarded ships and crossed the narrow strait of the Hellespont. Behind them lay a small but united Macedonian kingdom. Ahead of them stretched the Persian Empire, a political giant ruling lands from modern Turkey to Afghanistan, from the Aegean to the Indian Ocean. Its wealth was legendary. Its kings called themselves King of Kings. No Greek army had ever dreamed of bringing such a colossus down. Yet Persia in 334 was not invincible. Its empire was vast but decentralized. Satraps, provincial governors, ruled their regions like semi-independent lords. Rivalries among them were deep. Armies could be huge but uneven in training and loyalty. Darius III, the current great king, had taken the throne only recently and was still consolidating power. Alexander was betting that a fast, decisive strike could topple an empire before it fully woke to the threat. The first test came almost immediately at the Granicus River in Asia Minor. Persian satraps massed a cavalry-heavy force to crush the invaders before they gained a foothold. Crossing a fast river against waiting enemy horsemen was suicidal by normal standards. Alexander ignored normal standards. He personally led the companion cavalry into the torrent, his men bracing their long lances against the current and the charge. A Persian noble nearly killed him. An officer saved Alexander by striking down the attacker at the last second. Macedonian infantry followed, locked shields, and forced the Persians to break. The victory was bloody but electrifying. The myth of Persian invincibility cracked. Greek cities in Asia Minor, tired of Persian tribute, opened their gates. Sardis surrendered without a fight. Along the coast, Alexander positioned himself as a liberator, restoring democratic governments and winning goodwill. This was part war, part propaganda. The young king presented his campaign not as mere conquest, but as revenge and freedom for Greeks long under Persian control. Not everyone yielded. Halicarnassus, a heavily fortified city, resisted fiercely. Alexander laid siege using engines, towers, and naval pressure until its defenders burned parts of their own town and withdrew. He left garrisons and moved on, always forward. His army advanced methodically, securing supply lines and ports while projecting unstoppable momentum. In 333 BCE, he faced Darius himself near the small coastal plain of Issus. The Persians outnumbered Alexander 2 or 3 to 1, perhaps 100,000 against 40,000. But the battlefield was narrow, hemmed by sea and mountains. Darius could not fully deploy his massive force. Alexander seized the chance. He anchored his left with the phalanx, stretched his right to lure Persian cavalry, then saw and exploited a weak point near the Persian center. Riding at the head of the companion cavalry, he punched through toward Darius. The great king lost nerve, turned his chariot, and fled. His army, seeing their ruler vanish, collapsed. Macedonians captured Darius's mother, wife, and children. Alexander treated these royal captives with striking courtesy. He kept Darius's family unharmed and honored, sending a message. He was no mere plunderer, but a king claiming legitimate rule. This contrasted sharply with the brutal destruction of Thebes and was a calculated step toward winning Persian hearts. The road south led through Phoenicia, vital because its ports supplied the Persian fleet. Most cities surrendered quickly. Only Tyre, a wealthy island fortress, refused. Tyre believed itself untouchable, half a kilometer offshore, surrounded by high walls, defended by fleets. Alexander refused to move on. He built a causeway out from the coast toward the island, hauling stones and timber while Tyrians rained missiles and fire. When the first attempt burned, he rebuilt stronger. He captured ships, turned them into floating siege towers, and battered the sea walls. After 7 relentless months, the Macedonians stormed Tyre. The slaughter was grim. Survivors were sold into slavery. The fall of Tyre sent a chilling signal. There was no safe refuge from this young king. From Tyre he marched into Egypt. Here Persian rule was deeply hated, and priests saw an opportunity. Alexander was welcomed as a liberator without battle. At the desert Siwa oasis, the oracle of Amun pronounced him the son of Zeus Ammon. Ancient audiences took such proclamations seriously. For Alexander, it strengthened an image of divine favor that would follow him for the rest of his life. He founded Alexandria, envisioning a great Mediterranean hub of trade and culture. It would outlive him by millennia. Meanwhile, Darius raised another enormous army, perhaps 250,000 men, and waited on the plains near Gaugamelain, 331 BCE. Unlike Issus, this was open land ideal for Persian chariots and cavalry. Darius cleared and prepared the battlefield for his advantage. Alexander adapted. He extended his lines on the right, drawing Persian cavalry outward. When a gap opened in the Persian center, he launched a wedge attack directly toward Darius. Again the King of Kings broke and fled. Macedonians swept the field. Persian power, centuries old, shattered in a single day. After Gaugamela, the heart of the empire fell in quick succession. Babylon opened its gates and welcomed Alexander as ruler. Susa, rich with treasuries of gold and silver, surrendered, providing unimaginable wealth to fund future campaigns. Finally, Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenids, lay exposed. Alexander allowed his soldiers to plunder its vast riches. One night, drunken or deliberate, fires were set that consumed the great palaces. Some say it was revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens a century earlier. Others think Alexander later regretted the destruction. Either way, the symbol was clear. The old empire was dead. Darius fled east, hoping to raise new forces. He never got the chance. His own satrap Bessus betrayed and killed him, declaring himself king. When Alexander caught Bessus, he punished the traitor publicly and assumed the Persian royal title himself, King of Asia. Now the Macedonian was no longer simply invader or avenger. He was monarch of the world's largest empire. Yet with victory came change. Alexander began to adopt Persian dress, court rituals, and divine titles. He married Persian princesses, demanded that his officers prostrate themselves in the Persian style, and presented himself not just as a Macedonian king, but as a universal ruler. Some companions grumbled that he was going native. But Alexander was thinking bigger than tribal loyalty. He imagined a fused empire stretching beyond any Greek dream. And still, he was not done. Persia had fallen. But beyond Persia lay mysterious lands, Central Asia, India, the edge of the world. Alexander looked east and felt unfinished. Persia was broken. For most conquerors, that would have been enough. A vast empire had been taken. Treasuries overflowed with gold and silver. Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, the jewels of the ancient world, now obeyed a young Macedonian. His soldiers had marched farther than any European army in memory. His name was feared from the Aegean to the Zagros Mountains. But Alexander was not finished. To him, conquest was not only about wealth or vengeance. It was about destiny. He had grown up on stories of heroes who refused to stop. Achilles, Heracles, men who pushed beyond mortal limits. Now that the Persian king was dead and the empire lay at his feet, Alexander looked east to places few Greeks could even imagine. On his maps, the world blurred into rumor. Bactria, Sogdiana, Scythian horsemen, deserts and mountains, and beyond them India, a land of elephants and endless rivers. He wanted it all. First came the struggle for Central Asia. After Darius's death, not all Persian satraps accepted Alexander's rule. In Bactria and Sogdiana, regions roughly covering modern Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, resistance hardened. Local leaders rallied horse archers and guerrilla fighters. The terrain was brutal: high mountains, deep valleys, sudden ambushes. Supply lines stretched thin. Winter was merciless. These were not the set-piece battles of Greece or Mesopotamia, but a grinding war of raids and reprisals. Alexander adapted. He founded new cities, often named Alexandria, to secure roads and store supplies. He split his army into fast-moving columns to hunt rebels. He pursued enemies personally, crossing snowy passes where many thought no army could go. It was during this campaign that he met Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman, and married her. The marriage was political, meant to bind local elites to him, but also personal. Alexander believed he could knit his empire together not just by conquest, but by shared blood and culture. He encouraged his officers to do the same, to marry Persian and Central Asian women, to see themselves not just as Macedonians, but as rulers of a wider world. Many of his veterans hated this policy. They had followed him as a Greek avenger. Now they felt asked to become something else. Rumors spread that the king was going too far, abandoning his heritage. By 327 BCE, after years of harsh campaigning, Central Asia was pacified enough for Alexander to look further east. He turned his gaze to India, a land the Persians had once claimed but never fully controlled. Reports spoke of wealthy kingdoms, powerful war elephants, and great rivers flowing beyond measure. Alexander wanted to surpass Darius and Xerxes by reaching the edge of the known world. The invasion began with the crossing of the Hindu Kush, a brutal mountain march where cold, altitude, and thin supply lines tested the army's endurance. Many soldiers believed no sane commander would push farther. Yet Alexander pressed on. He fought and won against local kings, secured mountain passes, and descended into the Indus Valley. There he encountered King Porus, a formidable ruler with a disciplined army and something the Macedonians had never faced: elephants. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River in 326 BCE, Porus arrayed his forces on the far bank, confident the monsoon-swollen river would block any crossing. Alexander feigned movements downstream, then secretly marched upriver at night, crossed with a strike force, and attacked Porus's flank at dawn. The battle was savage. War elephants charged, trampling men and horses. Macedonian cavalry struck from the sides, while phalanxes endured the weight of the beasts. By day's end, Porus was defeated, but not humiliated. Impressed by his courage, Alexander returned him to his throne as a loyal ally. It was a rare moment where respect for an enemy shaped imperial policy. Yet victory in India came at a heavy price. The campaign was long, the monsoon rains relentless, diseases spread, and supplies ran thin. The army had been on the march for nearly a decade. Veterans were homesick, weary, and rich enough from plunder to want peace. When Alexander proposed advancing further east toward the Ganges, where even larger kingdoms awaited, his officers muttered and his soldiers finally broke. At the Hyphasis River, they refused to go on. It was a moment of quiet rebellion. No shouting, just a collective refusal to march another mile. For the first time, Alexander gave way. He returned to his tent in fury and grief, but he understood. The dream of reaching the ends of the earth would die here. His men had given him everything. To demand more was to risk total collapse. The march back west was punishing in its own right. Determined to map and explore, Alexander chose to lead part of the army through the Gedrosian Desert, an unforgiving expanse of heat, sand, and thirst along the southern coast of modern Iran and Pakistan. The choice remains debated. Some think he wanted to prove that even nature could not stop him, others that he underestimated the danger. Thousands died from exhaustion and dehydration. Men dropped in the sand and were left behind. For survivors, the desert march was a trauma never forgotten. When the army finally rejoined supply fleets and reached safer lands, Alexander held ceremonies to reward loyalty and integrate new Persian recruits into the ranks. He envisioned a fresh blended army, Macedonians and Persians drilled side by side, that could hold his vast empire together and push into Arabia, perhaps even beyond. But this vision clashed with his original companions. Many officers resented seeing Persians promoted and Macedonian traditions diluted. Conspiracies surfaced. Old friends murmured about how far their king had drifted from the boy they once knew. Alexander responded with both generosity and ruthlessness. He hosted grand feasts blending Greek and Persian customs. He rewarded loyal generals, but executed those he deemed traitors. He demanded recognition as divine, not just a king, but something higher. To some, this was visionary. To others, it was hubris. Then, in 323 BCE, while planning new campaigns in Arabia, Alexander's body failed. In Babylon, after a long night of drinking and discussion, he fell into fever. The illness worsened over days, weakness, pain, and the inability to speak. He was carried to the palace gardens where his soldiers filed past in silence, touching his hand one last time. Asked who should succeed him, he reportedly whispered, "To the strongest." On June 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander the Great, undefeated in battle, master of an empire spanning 3 continents, died at 32. The edge of the world had been closer than he imagined. His body could go no further. The death of Alexander in Babylon sent a shock through his empire like a thunderclap. For more than a decade, tens of thousands of men had marched under his banner across deserts and mountains, into cities they could not have named before. They had lived with one certainty: their king was invincible. He had never lost a battle. He had always found a way forward. And then, suddenly, he was gone, felled not by an enemy's sword, but by fever and frailty, the same weaknesses that claimed ordinary men. What remained behind was a question larger than any single victory. Who rules when the conqueror is no more? Alexander left no clear heir. His only legitimate son, Alexander IV, had not yet been born. His half-brother, Aridaeus, was alive but mentally unfit to rule. On his deathbed, when asked to whom he left his empire, Alexander's supposed reply, "To the strongest," was less a solution than a spark that lit civil war. The generals who had followed him, men who had once been companions and brothers in arms, became rivals overnight. This scramble for power is remembered as the Wars of the Diadochi, the Wars of the Successors. Within weeks of Alexander's funeral, the empire fractured. At first, a fragile arrangement kept things together. Philip Aridaeus and the infant Alexander IV were declared kings in name, while regents ruled in practice. But ambition could not be contained. Antipater in Macedon, Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Babylon, Antigonus in Asia Minor. Each man believed he had the right, or at least the opportunity, to carve a kingdom of his own. The unity Alexander had imagined, a single empire spanning from Greece to India, dissolved almost instantly. By the time his son was murdered in 310 BCE, every trace of central authority was gone. What replaced it were new dynasties: the Ptolemies in Egypt, who would rule for 3 centuries, the Seleucids in Asia, who would stretch Greek culture deep into the east, the Antigonids in Macedon, who tried to keep a foothold in Greece. The empire had become not one body, but many heads, locked in endless wars. And yet, even in this collapse, Alexander's shadow loomed. Each of these rulers justified their claims by invoking him. They minted coins with his image, claimed to defend his legacy, or married into his family line. To be a successor meant to borrow his aura. Without Alexander's name, none of them could hope for legitimacy. The irony was stark. He had conquered for himself, but his empire lived on only through fragments, each ruled by men who fought to imitate him. For the common soldier, the fallout was equally harsh. Veterans who had survived deserts and battles returned home changed. Some were rich with plunder, others were scarred, broken, or left behind in garrison towns across Asia. Thousands had married foreign wives in accordance with Alexander's policy of cultural fusion. For them, there was no simple return to Greece or Macedon. They were part of something new, the Hellenistic world, where Greek language and customs blended with Persian, Egyptian, and Indian traditions. That blending may be Alexander's most enduring legacy. His campaigns spread Greek ideas across continents. Cities he founded, Alexandria in Egypt, but also others in Bactria, Arachosia, and beyond, became centers of trade and learning. In these cities, Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, Persian nobles, and Indian traders met and exchanged knowledge. Mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and art traveled more freely than before. A Greek-speaking merchant could now sail from the Nile to the Indus and be understood in markets along the way. Economically, the vast flow of Persian treasure into Macedonian hands destabilized old systems but also fueled expansion. Coins bearing Alexander's face circulated widely, unifying trade. Caravans crossed lands that had once been fractured by hostile borders. In this sense, his empire died, but the network it created endured. Culturally, the impact was immense. Greek became the language of elites from Egypt to Afghanistan. Greek theaters, temples, and schools appeared in distant lands. But this was no one-way imposition. Greek religion absorbed Eastern gods. Greek art borrowed from Persian motifs. Even Buddhism in India evolved under Hellenistic influence, producing Greco-Buddhist sculptures that fused two worlds. This synthesis, called the Hellenistic Age, lasted centuries and shaped civilizations far beyond Alexander's life. Politically, however, his death exposed a flaw. Conquest without institutions cannot last. Alexander had been the glue. He ruled by personal charisma, by a mystique of invincibility, by leading charges himself. But he had never built a stable system to replace him. When the man vanished, the machine broke. Generals who had once followed willingly now fought one another in brutal wars, undoing the unity he had forged with such blood. For history, the aftermath offers both admiration and warning. Admiration because one man's vision had reshaped the map and opened pathways for cultural exchange. Warning because even the greatest victories can collapse into chaos if there is no plan for succession. For his soldiers, the story was more personal. Many had marched further than they thought possible, seen wonders they could not have dreamed of, and endured suffering beyond measure. Some returned home with wealth, but lived haunted lives. Others never returned, buried in distant lands or settled in cities far from Macedonia. Their king had given them glory, but also grief. The fallout of Alexander's death was not simply the end of an empire. It was the start of a new world. One where Greek influence radiated east, where cities blended cultures, where conquerors from Rome to Napoleon would look back and measure themselves against a Macedonian who died at 32. And all of it began with that fever in Babylon, the single ordinary weakness that ended an extraordinary dream. Stand back from the battles and look at the arc of one life. A boy born in a rough northern kingdom, told by his mother that he was descended from gods, trained by the greatest philosopher of his age, inheriting an army forged by a ruthless father, and by 32, dead in a foreign palace, having conquered more of the known world than anyone before him. That is Alexander's story, stripped to its spine. Yet the meaning of that story is more complicated than simple triumph. Alexander is remembered as the Great because he did what seemed impossible. He took a state that Greek city-states mocked as barbarian and used it to topple the richest empire on earth. He never lost a pitched battle. He marched farther and faster than generals with twice his resources. His victories, Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, are still studied by soldiers for their precision and daring. He showed that with vision, speed, and adaptability, a smaller, disciplined force can break a lumbering giant. But greatness is not only measured in victories, it is measured in cost. Behind every maneuver were thousands of men walking into deserts, drowning in rivers, dying of fever in jungles they had never imagined. Cities that resisted him were razed. Populations were enslaved. Cultures were remade by force. His march east left as many graves as monuments. For those who lived through it, the legend of Alexander was built on blood. His personal ambition drove him beyond rational limits. Conquering Persia would have secured his name forever, yet he kept pushing. Into the wilds of Central Asia, where guerrilla war drained his army. Into India, where his men finally refused to go on. Through the Drowzy desert, where thousands perished in sand and thirst. Even after all this, sick and exhausted, he was planning more campaigns. Arabia, perhaps Carthage, maybe the Western Mediterranean. He could not stop because to stop felt like dying. And when his body forced him to stop, death came swiftly. And yet, paradoxically, that same restless drive created something lasting. His conquests opened channels between worlds that had been isolated. Greek thought mixed with Eastern religion and science. Trade routes expanded, ideas traveled, medicine from Egypt, astronomy from Babylonia, philosophy from Greece, art from Persia and India. Cities he founded, especially Alexandria in Egypt, became melting pots where cultures met and learned from one another. The Hellenistic age that followed was not his empire, but it was his legacy. Alexander also changed what it meant to rule. Before him, kings were often local warlords. After him, conquerors dreamed global dreams. Caesar carried a copy of the Iliad because Alexander had. Napoleon studied his campaigns. Modern generals still trace lines on maps that echo his. He became the model of personal, charismatic command, but also the cautionary tale of what happens when a state depends on one extraordinary individual with no plan for succession. His story forces questions that do not fade with time. How far should ambition go? Is the desire to achieve immortality through deeds worth the cost to those who must follow? Can one person truly unite cultures, or is such unity an illusion that dies with them? Alexander tried to answer by blending Greek and Persian worlds, by encouraging intermarriage, by adopting foreign customs. Some called it visionary. Others called it betrayal. The experiment died with him, but the idea of global identity he toyed with still lingers. There is also the human puzzle at the center of the legend. We often imagine him as a marble hero, calm, brilliant, invincible. But he was a man in his 20s and early 30s making decisions that shaped millions of lives. He was charismatic but insecure, capable of kindness and of terrifying cruelty. He honored enemies like Porus and Darius's family, yet destroyed Thebes and Tyre. He could reward loyalty, but also execute friends in paranoia. His genius and flaws were entwined. Perhaps that is why his story endures. It is not just about maps changing color. It is about the intoxicating danger of believing destiny belongs to you. It is about youth refusing limits and paying for that refusal. It is about how a single life, brief and burning, can redirect history even as it collapses under its own ambition. When you hear the name Alexander the Great, it is easy to picture the statues and coins, the grand victories and the empire stretching across continents. But remember also the silent cost. The soldiers buried in foreign soil, the cultures upended, the families waiting for men who would never return. Remember the fragility behind the legend. An empire that began and ended with one man's heartbeat. And yet, something undeniable remains. More than 2 millennia later, when people speak of conquering the world, they still mean what he did. His name has become shorthand for boundless ambition. His shadow falls across every map a dreamer studies. The boy from Macedon chased immortality and, in a way, found it. Not through peace, not through building a lasting state, but through a narrative so compelling that centuries of generals, kings, and scholars cannot let it go. He died young, but his story refuses to end. If you were 20 and handed the same chance, the army, the moment, the dream, would you take it, knowing how it ends? Would you risk everything for greatness that outlives you, even if the empire itself will not? That question haunted Alexander. Perhaps it should haunt us too.